You're listening to Beyond the Sermon, the podcast of First Methodist Church in Collingswood, New Jersey. On our podcast, the goal is not just to share our sermons, but to go beyond the sermon and talk about what we're learning and what God is doing in us and in our community. The conversation you're about to join was inspired by our Fall 2024 series, A Heart Like His, Seeing the Heart of God in the Life of David. In this series, we're asking the question, what does it look like for us to be a people after God's own heart? You can find more information about our church at fumccollingswood.org. Thanks for joining us for this conversation.
First question. If you were Uzzah, would you have tried to stop the ark from falling?
Probably.
Yeah, I think I would.
Yeah.
It's like a natural reaction.
Right.
And it's something so important to you and your people.
Yeah.
Natural reflex. Because of how athletic we are, we would have...
Like Spider-Man, right? But yeah, I think I would have.
Yeah. And it almost, because of the consequences, because of how holy God is and how the ark was supposed to be handled, it almost kind of like paints this picture of like, well, you should have listened to God.
Yeah.
But I don't think that would have been in his, like, the thing in his head at the very moment.
No, and I mean, if we think about the timeline, like we totally squished the timeline yesterday for the sake of the sermon, but...
Yeah, you're welcome.
But it sat in his father's house for 20 years.
Yeah.
Like, it had been 20 years since the people at Bet Shemesh opened it and 70 people were killed. So that was like distant memory.
Yeah.
And I'm sure at that point, like, the correlation probably wasn't, oh, we touched the ark, but that they opened it and looked inside.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So for him to think, oh, it's falling, let me just reach out and...
Yeah.
And clearly the law wasn't such a part of their life at that point.
Yeah.
That, they understood all these things, or they wouldn't have put it on a ox cart to begin with.
Yeah. Right. Now, while listening to the sermon and you kind of going through, kind of fast forwarding through the second half of Exodus about how the temple was built and organized and designed and all of that, it kind of got me more and more intrigued and excited to go visit the replica of the temple. I think it's out in Pennsylvania, right?
Yeah, Lancaster area.
Yeah, and so I was wondering, what would it take for us to do a church trip out to the temple?
Someone who does the legwork and organizes and takes responsibility for making sure we have enough people to cover, if we have to get a bus or rent a van or something like that. I don't think it would take much more than that.
Well, I'm glad you volunteered for that, Scott.
I did not volunteer for that.
But if anyone else has that same interest after hearing sermon, or if that's just been something you've been interested in for a while, let us know and maybe we can collaborate to try and get something in the works. And of course, Shady Maple would be included.
I think it's A.B. Simpson. And I haven't actually read this book, but it's been recommended to me. I think A.B. Simpson has a book about, I think it might be called With Christ in the Tabernacle, that talks about how all the furniture within the tabernacle points forward to Christ and how he fulfills the different things. And yeah, it's one that Ron would recommend to me.
$200?
Well, it's an old book.
Scott, what kind of money do you think we got?
I haven't read it.
That's why you haven't read it. Oh my gosh. Or $4 on Kindle.
I mean, pick your poison. Christ in the Tabernacle, that's what it is. An Old Testament portrayal of the Christ of the New Testament. A.B. Simpson.
Oh, that sounds riveting. Wow. Yeah, no, I might have to add that to my extremely long list of books that I want to read. Yeah, yesterday...
Well, you can read the book, plan the trip, and then be our tour guide.
Do you think we'd get a discount?
No.
Oh. Look, I'll take it from here. Just because you do this every day, let me take the reins. Yeah, so that was on my mind. It was just such an interesting. I think yesterday's sermon service was holy.
Ba-dum-bum.
It wasn't even intended, but I'll take the credit. And it's really hard for me to like pinpoint it. At least in the sermon, it's hard for me to pinpoint it. But when we entered into communion, it felt for me that the tone, the way that you transitioned us into it, it felt less ritualistic and more just like a really holy opportunity to partake in the sacraments.
Yeah.
And it's odd because we did a lot of the same things we do every single time. But there's just something really, really holy and special about yesterday's communion that I really appreciated.
I felt the shift during the offerings when Aaron and the team were leading us in
Nothing else, I think.
nothing else. Yeah. Like, I don't know if that was just me connecting with God during it, but that's where I felt like that felt like a very holy moment.
Yeah.
Especially after the offering kind of finished and people joined in the worship. Maybe it was the fact that I wasn't playing and I was just standing up on the platform and I could hear everyone. It was a sweet moment.
Yeah. I'm curious if that kind of changed anything within your message in comparison to the first one, whether it be tone or passion in a certain section or an emphasis in a certain area.
Yeah, I mean the whole ending of the sermon and the transition into communion, like none of that was scripted. That was just flowing out of what I had shared, what I felt like the Spirit was saying. That was my favorite part. Yeah, well, and
wow.
fair.
Yeah.
But I got to the end of my sermon as written and didn't feel like I was done. And so kept
just stop
going.
preparing and just let the Spirit lead.
Well, I mean, so here's the reality. If I were to do that, get ready for much longer sermons because a big part of my preparation is identifying what God's not asking me to talk about.
Yeah.
You know, it's not just what does God want to say, but what are all the other things that could take us off in rabbit trails that don't actually help move the message forward.
Yeah.
And so if I was just doing all that on the fly, Spirit could still take control and do it, but my tendency is to go longer without prepared notes.
Yeah. Yeah. And so even within your preparation, is there anything extra that you took out because you thought it would be a side trail that would get us kind of off course?
At one point, I thought about bringing in a little talking point about like why the historical books are structured the way they are. But that's
as in like formatting of writing or like the order in which they are in the Bible?
Some of all of it, but like,
okay.
Do you know why we have 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel?
Because there were twins born and they just said Samuel 1, Samuel 2.
No.
And it's their story.
No.
And it's a lovely story.
No. Samuel was too long for one scroll.
I didn't know that.
First Samuel and second. Similarly, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. It's all one contiguous story, but it just didn't fit on one scroll. So they ended up putting it on two. And so,
that doesn't apply in the New Testament because they're separate letters.
But yeah, they're separate letters. Yeah.
I was like, because those are all really short. That would make sense.
Well, and so similarly, at that point, then they were using like parchments, which would have been a lot smaller.
Yeah.
So the letters were limited in some sense because of how expensive parchment was.
Yeah.
So like that, but then also like, okay, so why do we have Samuel and Kings and Chronicles? Like, doesn't Chronicles basically tell a lot of the same stories in a little bit different of a way? And it does. And it's because Samuel and Kings were written like as the accounts and as Samuel or whoever. I mean, clearly not Samuel, because he dies halfway through, First Samuel.
Yeah.
So someone under the tutelage of Samuel put together these accounts. Similarly, Kings. But then Chronicles, scholars believe, wasn't actually written until the exile or after the exile. As people looked back at these stories and reflected, okay, because they were trying to answer the question, why did we end up in exile?
Mm-hmm.
And how can we avoid it in the future?
Yeah.
And so they took the stories from places like Kings and other sources like that, because there are some stories in Chronicles that don't show up in Kings and Samuel. And then they kind of like reflected theologically on them. So in Chronicles, you get a lot more like, this was a terrible king who did wicked things. This was a good king, and here are the good things they did.
Yeah.
And because they're trying to figure out the formula, so to speak, of how do we stay in right relationship with God? How do we not go into exile again? So Chronicles kind of gives you a different perspective. So, that's part of the reason probably that in Chronicles you get a fuller accounting of this story, where there's some fleshing out about the stuff about the Levites and stuff, because the Jewish people at that point were realizing like, oh, we've got to keep the law. This is an important part. And this is where like the Pharisees flow out of that later movement and that kind of stuff. But so for them to put it as like, oh, the law says Levites carrying da-da-da-da-da, this is why this is important.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
Yeah, really interesting, but didn't necessarily
help where we were going
with what I was doing in the sermon.
Yeah. No, that's really good. And so with this heavy emphasis on the holiness of God and who he is, and something that we were just studying with the youth, we're going through Proverbs, and it was the whole thing about like the Lord disciplines his children, and we connected it to Hebrews 12, where it's like God's discipline is perfect and is for good, and it gives us the opportunity to share in his holiness. And so that's something that we as his people can share in. Do you have any examples in your walk where something heightened your awareness of just how holy God was or is? I'm thinking of like I know God's holy, God's holy, God's holy. And then you have either a personal experience, or you read scripture and it sticks out to you in a new way, and God gives you a new perspective on it.
I don't know when exactly it was, but as we were preparing to go to the mission field, and even early on in our time there is somewhere in that window, when we were going over, we knew that we were going to be part of a team that was training pastors, and one of the methods that they had adopted was called Simply the Story. It was an oral method of doing inductive Bible study, where you learn the story and then you present it and you ask questions and help people dig into what the story actually says. And in the training for that, one of the stories they put early on was when the leper comes and falls before Jesus. And he says, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean." And the story says Jesus was filled with compassion for the man and reached out his hand and touched him. And immediately the man became whole. And then he, tells the man not to go and tell anyone, but to go straight to the priest, so it could be a testimony to them, blah, blah, blah. And the idea, right, because with leprosy, anyone they touched or who touched anything they had touched became contaminated and unclean and had to go through all these ritual processes and blah, 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 blah. But when Jesus reached out and touched him, rather than being contaminated, the man was made clean.
Mm-hmm.
That was such a perspective shifting realization for me. Like, kind of like we were talking about yesterday, like when God's presence comes, it cleans us up. It's not doom and gloom and fire and brimstone.
Mm-hmm.
He comes and cleanses us. He comes and heals us. He comes to make us whole just by his presence. What about for you, Jeremy? Anything stick in your mind?
I guess the general and a specific. In general, seeing like things that were intended for or are normally very bad, and seeing him able to use them for good and even great things that could not be possible without him. And it can be something as small as like a conversation with someone and seeing God use that. And you know, like you never talk to the person, you have one conversation and then you see a giant shift in their life as you try and steer them towards Christ. Something like that, or more specifically, when we were at New Room the first year, we talked about like that worship time.
Yeah.
Yeah, to feel so out of time and space and just in his presence in like a way that I've never experienced before. And it just, yeah, cranked up not my expectation for worship, but what corporate worship, like the potential, like I guess I glass ceilinged the potential for worship. And then to see that and experience that was like, oh yeah, you can't get this at a concert or whatever. Like, right, people connect to music in so many different ways, and people say that, you know, going to worship is, you know, people are just connecting to the music. So if you like the music, then that's why you get like
right.
this good experience. And I know I've had things greater than a normal concert, even by my favorite artist, in worship, here in church, Passion, all these things I've been to have been greater than concerts, but just to such a holy level that it's not even comparable. Yeah, that made a mark.
Yeah.
How do you explain God's holiness? I would say how would you explain it to someone that knows virtually nothing about Christianity? And then how would you explain it to someone that's grown up in the church but feels like they've never experienced God? Just throwing some softballs your way.
Yeah. Well, and somehow like the sum total of who God is and all of his attributes kind of come together in the phrase of holy love, right? And his holiness is the side of things where we see his justice and his righteousness, and there is a standard. I think you could sum it up as like saying God is holy. You could also say like God always does what is right, and somehow because he knows what is right in every situation, and it's not just that because God does it, it is right. Like, it's not that kind of circular reason, but yeah, somehow God always does what's right. He always does what is true to who he is and how he's made the world, which means that then for us to be in relationship with him, there are expectations. There's a standard we have to live according to. And I think for someone who is part of the church or a church and feels like they've never experienced it, I think on the human side of it, I don't know if it's the chicken or the egg, but God's holiness, our experience of God's holiness has a direct correlation to our willingness to surrender. And I don't know if it's like Isaiah, we have this experience of God's holiness, and the only proper response then is surrender. God, you can have everything. Here I am. send me. Or if there's a sense in which it's like when we get to that point where we say, okay, God, you can have all of me. He says, okay, and here's who I am. Here's who I want to be in your life. Here's who I want you to be. But I think there's definitely some level of interplay between the idea of holiness and our surrender.
Yeah.
Anything you would add or push back on, or
I maybe just add in regards to the surrendering of just like he knows a man's heart, and so the sincerity of the surrendering and the all-encompassing surrender, because I think that sometimes people think I'm surrendering and it's more of it might be a different area, right? We have our time, our resources, our gifts and talents or whatever, and we're like, okay, I'm surrendering this area, right? I'm going to volunteer at church for this, or I'm going to start tithing for real this time, or whatever it might be, and think that counts as the full surrender, and then get frustrated when there's a lack of response. Or the response that they anticipate, right? It might, God may be working things and blessing them, and they just don't acknowledge it because it's not what they're anticipating as the experience. I don't know. It's very complicated, and we are not God because He is holy.
Yeah. But that's part of the process that we call sanctification, right? It's as we begin to know more of ourselves in light of who God is, we then surrender more of ourselves. There's definitely a sense in which at conversion, when we're justified, we get all of God. We have access to all of God, but it's then in that process of sanctification and surrender that God gets all of us.
Yeah.
And it's continual growth because as he moves deeper into our lives, into our hearts, he then begins to shine a light on different areas. And when we realize, oh, yeah, that is another area that I need to surrender.
Like the rich man.
Yep.
So we went over at youth group last night, and how the one verse that I really loved, where right before Jesus kind of calls him out, right? The rich man is lying straight to Jesus's face. Yeah, I've kept all the commandments since I was young. And instead of Jesus being like, really? He looks at him, and in NLT it says he looks upon him with genuine love. And then he asks him about his money and his possessions and stuff like that. And so, I think it's a beautiful thing walking with the Lord, and he doesn't always... It's like you've talked before about the difference between conviction and shame.
Yeah.
And it's all for our good. So we're just foolish when we don't take his wisdom.
If anyone is looking to explore this idea of holiness further, I recently picked up a new book that I think is doing a fantastic job of laying things out. It's short. It's only 100 pages. It's called Free to Be Holy by Matt O'Reilly. And I'd highly recommend it to anybody who's looking for it or looking for something more. Well, that's our conversation for today. But that doesn't mean the conversation is over. We'd love to hear your thoughts on these topics as well. To ask a question about anything we've discussed in this episode or to join the conversation, you can head over to fumccollingswood.org/podcast. Thanks for being part of this conversation.